Bell is proud to sponsor Vertical Helicasts and their vision to hold meaningful mission, safety, and best practice conversations in the helicopter industry. The lessons learned from these conversations will undoubtedly shape the future of both new and veteran helicopter operators.
Hey guys, it's Halsey Schider with the Helicopter Podcast. And, well, happy almost New Year. This episode should be coming at you, I believe, the day after Christmas. So I hope that you and your family had a wonderful holiday, whether it was Christmas or whatever it is that you celebrate. I know that my wife and I have had a wonderful holiday so far. Need a little bit more snow. Pacific Northwest, El Nino. Look, I know I'm a pilot. I should know more about weather. I don't fully understand El Nino, but it's bringing a lot of moisture, but it's not bringing cold enough temperatures. So if anyone knows Mother Nature can help me out, I would love to have a little bit more snow up here in the Pacific Northwest, as the skiing has been kind of just subpar so far. Anyway, I want to take this opportunity to kind of do something a little bit different. My team and I thought that this would be a great way to wrap up a very exciting 2023 for the Helicopter Podcast. It's been a big year, guys. So much has happened with the Helicopter Podcast. We've picked up some sponsors, so I'm so thankful for Bell Helicopters, who sponsors the Helicopter Podcast now, and of course Celicopter, who also sponsors the Helicopter Podcast. And a big thanks to our friends at MHM Publishing for creating an amazing platform that's Vertical Helicasts. If you haven't checked out Vertical Helicasts yet, you totally need to. It's the Helicopter Podcast. It's the Hangar Z Podcasts with John Gray, and the Real Rescue with Jason Quinn, a.k.a. Quinny. And I'm told there's more podcasts joining. And essentially our goal, it's pretty simple. We want to create a one-stop shop with helicopter content. So we have Vertical Magazine, we have Valor Magazine with MHM, and now we have these podcasts, and we can incorporate these podcasts into these already amazing and existing publications, giving kind of a multi-level media experience, which I think is super awesome. And I'm grateful to be a part of it. You know, the Helicopter Podcast, as I think I've talked about before, was just something I started. Never thought it would be where it's at, but it's turned into something really special. And that's because of you, my listeners. So big shout out and big thanks to you guys. Thanks for reaching out. I get a lot of messages on Instagram, Facebook. Be patient. Sometimes a little slow to respond, but I will try to get back to every single one of you. And hey, the good news is 2024 is going to be our best year yet. Big plans for HI Heli Expo this year, and some really cool guests, including our first episode of the new year. It's going to be Kevin LaRosa. If you don't know who Kevin LaRosa is, you're certainly familiar with his work. Kevin LaRosa is an aerial coordinator and a stunt pilot in Hollywood. And Kevin is most notably known for Top Gun Maverick. So I sat down, had a wonderful conversation with Kevin, and that episode is going to post, I believe, on January 2nd. So we're going to start the year off with a bang. But for today's episode, we thought it'd be really fun to kind of look back at this year and play some clips of some of the episodes that stood out. Big thanks to all my guests, because everyone brought something amazing to the table. But these were just some conversations that stood out to me. So the first one was my buddy Eli Malloy. Eli, you're probably familiar with him. He's very big on social media, puts out incredible content, and seriously one of the nicest dudes. Him and I have only met through the podcast and on the phone, never met him in person, unfortunately. I hope to change that this year. But just in my interactions, he's like the nicest guy. And something that he brought up in the podcast is this idea of being a first generation pilot. And I kind of ended up using that throughout the entire year of the podcast, because I think it's just so cool of an idea, of something I never thought of that it's legit a little bit of a struggle getting into aviation as a first generation pilot, meaning that your parents, your grandparents, no one before you had really been involved in aviation, let alone helicopter aviation. So check out this excerpt from my chat with Eli Malloy. I think you're going to really enjoy it.
And so she was a nurse, and at that time, like, it was really easy to get into the rewards for, like, financially. It was a good career. You could travel. Being a male nurse was even better because you could have a job anywhere, and it was in high demand. So she was really encouraging me to become a male nurse. And so I would, like, go to the hospital with her every now and then, take lunch to her, hang out with her. And then one day I went to lunch and looked out the window, and, like, lo and behold, there comes the helicopter. And I was like, that's cool. Like, that seems cool. And the flight crew gets out, and I'm, like, looking out the window, and some old dude, I mean, at the time I was 20, like, some old dude, I think he ended up,
he was like 30.
yeah, I mean, who knows how old he was, but he gets out, and I was like, cool, cool, cool. And Mom was like, oh, you should be a flight nurse. Like, that's cool. There we go. There's a little bit of Eli and, like, viable career. Like, it could be stable and it could be predictable. My parents love that, and I was like, no, medicine, not my thing. Like, but the pilot, he seems pretty chill. He seems pretty cool. And so literally I went back to college. It was like tail end of my freshman year, and I was just kind of, like, in this weird spot. I was feeling kind of depressed. Like, I had lost part of my identity in sports and, like, social circles and things like that. And so I was just kind of in this phase of limbo. And I started to get on Google and was like, flight schools near me, and then I just found this guy in Georgetown, Kentucky, Officer Don. He's a radio show host, retired cop, who had an R-22 at the local airport, and he was, like, a flight instructor. And
Nice.
so I hit him. Yeah, Officer Don. Yeah, I mean, shout out to Officer Don, 98.1 The Bull in Lexington. He does, like, like, Skywatch traffic. Yeah, he was a badass. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, I hit him up, and I was like, hey, like, I don't even know anything about this, but I kind of want to come and try it out. And so we set up a discovery flight. And before I went to the discovery flight, I showed my parents. I was like, hey, seems pretty cool. They were like, okay, well, you can go try it out. It was like a couple $100. I didn't have any money, so my parents were like, hey, we'll pay for the first lesson. If you, like, come and present us with a package of, like, what kind of jobs this industry has, what it takes, how much money it requires, like, all this stuff. So I, like, presented this little business plan. And I think I presented, like, you could become a law enforcement pilot, and you could fly air medical, and you can do all this stuff. I don't even know what I even said. And I don't know what I even said I'd make or how much I would spend. But they were like, okay, cool. I think it's more about the effort that I put in to know that I was serious about it. Yeah.
Sure.
So I remember I went and did a discovery flight. And the moment I got in the helicopter, I was just like, whoa. It was like, at that point in my life, everything was just kind of flying over my head. I was just like a passenger to life. And then it just, like, smacked me in the face. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever done. And I have to keep doing it. And so what I decided to do was just continue taking lessons, evenings, weekends. I went to University of Kentucky. I was in college. I went to get a degree in business, but on the side, I also pursued flight school. And I never was able to see, like, the longevity of where I was going because I was first generation. My parents had no idea. We had no network. We had no friends. We had no mutual connections that were pilots. Nobody in my hometown was a helicopter pilot. Nobody. And so for me, I was just kind of, like, macheteing through the jungle, like, lesson by lesson, figuring it out. And so I remember, it took me like a year or so to get a private license just because I wasn't very motivated. I was just school and travel and off and on. And then, like, when I got my license, I was like, now what? Like, what do I do with now? And then it just kind of kept going and kept going. So first generation, for me, I've always taken a lot of pride. I think it's been like a chip on my shoulder. And you could probably relate to that. It's been about 10 years now, and every single time I do something new, it is the first time. And I take a lot of pride. And I'm not saying I haven't had a lot of help, because I have had a lot of help, and I have great mentors and people that have plucked me and put me places and recommended and referred me and supported me and given me chances. But at the same token, I didn't have a dad that put me in an airplane and I had a check ride on my 16th birthday. I'm not saying that's a
Sure.
bad thing. I'm just saying like that wasn't me. That wasn't my experience. Like
Yeah, different.
I did it all from scratch. And, that's what I tried to pass on to people is like every connection I made, I asked for, I networked and I hit him up and I called him and I made the phone calls and I knocked on the doors. And, I think that like, you can empathize with that. It has made me a much better person in the long run because I wasn't just handed a connection or handed an opportunity. I had to work for every single second in every single relationship. And when I think of first generation, that's really what hits home the most.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's like you said, it's not bad. If you come from a long
Mhm.
line of aviation
I
or
wish I had.
aviators, I
I
should
wish I had
say.
because it would have been much easier.
Yeah. But,
Yeah.
I think that there's also, I think that you're kind of a similar guy like
Yeah.
to me where it's almost a point of pride to
Mhm.
do it yourself. Not only did I not come from an aviation family, but I came from a family of blue collar, hardworking folks,
Mhm.
which sounds similar, to your situation, at least on
Mhm.
your dad's side.
Yeah.
Um, and so kind of everything I do in life kind of makes me feel really proud, and I
Mhm.
think, maybe what my parents didn't give me in aviation networking and knowledge and or even a ton of financial assistance.
Yeah.
They gave me a lot of love and support.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of allowed me to have a good foundation to be successful and just be a good human. My
Yeah.
parents taught me to.
I think that's really important, like what you said there, because no, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more on it later, but I think the things that have benefited me the most in aviation have nothing to do with aviation. It's it's soft skills and people skills, and it's stuff like it's basic stuff that people just skip over. It has nothing
Sure.
to do. Yeah, I am not the best pilot, and I am not. I mean, I like to think that I'm a good pilot. Like I take pride in that. But I'm not the best. There are people way smarter and way better at me. But do what or say what you're going to do and do what you say. Tell the truth,
Hmm.
like honesty, integrity, like uh, helping people out. Doing things without expectation of in return. All the fundamental principles that like your parents instill in you. Those are the things. Being empathetic, being relatable. Uh, coming from blue collar rural Kentucky, it's like I'm not used to the finer things in life. So it's like
Sure.
but now that's what I deal with, and it makes me relatable, and I'm a human being, and you know, being a human being and being yourself as you go through the career, that's what is important to me, and that's what I've taken from my hometown. Has nothing to do with aviation, and so like
Sure.
to keep my finger on the pulse of like who I am and
Yeah, it's important.
how that fits into what I'm doing. Not what I'm doing makes me a different person. You know what I'm saying?
And I think it's easy to get caught up. I think that we can all, especially in my perspective, like having my own business, it's like I can sometimes see that, I define myself as my business,
Hmm.
and I have to kind of check myself because it's like, the business is a part of what I do in my life and it's
Yeah.
something I'm proud of, but my business isn't me per se. You know, Halsey is the same Halsey that he's always
Yeah.
been, a little bit goofy, a little bit socially uncomfortable, um, decent pilot. Certainly not the best. I know that for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the listeners of the podcasts, in fact, I had a gentleman reach out today. It's a lot of younger guys and gals that are kind of asking for mentorship,
Sure.
advice, which is super cool. And again, something that even you and I didn't necessarily have access to when we were going
Yeah.
through school. I mean, with podcasts and YouTube and everything today, there's a lot more people that are obtainable or reachable, I should say. Um, so it's like I always, from especially from a hiring, I've been in a position of hiring pilots, and it's like if someone's coming in your door and their resume says they have X amount of hours and that meets your requirement and you can do a quick logbook audit to confirm, you kind of just hope that they could fly decently.
Yeah.
Really, what I'm looking for is the personality. Do I want to
Yeah.
work with this person? Do I want to have them represent my company? Those are kind of the more important factors. And, I think every generation things change a little bit. I think the generation coming up, the younger guys and gals have a lot of resources available to them, but also a lot of distractions and, maybe not as used to, networking and things like that. So,
Yeah.
I hope that our listeners of the podcast that are trying to figure out their next step and getting a job and whatnot, I hope that they listen to what you just said about, you just got to be a good person. Got to do what
Yeah.
you say you're going to do, have integrity. And, I think it's, people when you get hired as an air medical pilot, it's going to be uncomfortable for a little bit. You're not going to be the best air medical pilot right away. It takes time and training, and you get better and you figure things out. But going up and showing up to the interview and just being a nice human, ready to
Yeah.
learn, and showing that's kind of the most important part. It doesn't really matter
Yeah.
about your hours at that point. All right, so that was from episode number 26, again with my good buddy Eli Malloy. Again, the idea of this first generation. And I think that this is something that the podcast, not just my podcast, but the Hangar Z, the Real Rescue, and the other aviation style podcasts are allowing you, our listeners, maybe young men and women, middle aged men and women, second career, I don't know. It's allowing you guys a path to success, learning through, vicariously through some of the mistakes that I've made, my guests have made, Eli. So I thought that was a really cool thing of being a first generation pilot. I'm a first generation pilot, and I know a lot of my listeners are out there. So, Eli Malloy, thank you for that tidbit. I really enjoyed that episode. Again, that's episode number 26 if you want to listen to the whole thing. And you can also find Eli on social media. It's Eli underscore the heli guy. Okay, so Eli underscore the heli guy. Follow him. He's awesome. You're going to really enjoy his Instagram. And speaking of Instagram, last year at Heli Expo, I was super lucky to meet some other individuals within the industry that are influencers. Not saying that I'm an influencer, by far, don't really think I am. Again, I'm just glad to have a little bit of a voice in this industry. But one of the guys that I met at HAI and actually ended up doing a H145 demo with was David Allen Arnold. And if you're not familiar with David, such a cool guy. David is definitely an influencer. I don't know what his following is right now for his Instagram account, which is, I believe, Airborne Camera. I can check that, and I should check that real fast. Make sure we're just kind of going live here, so let's just make sure it's Airborne Camera. That's his tag, so that's where you can find him. He puts out super cool content. Does a ton of aerial photography. He's been doing it for 30 plus years, and his story is so cool. And when I sat down with him in the episode that I recorded with David, which is episode number 23, we just had a good time. We learned all about his career. And then one of the notable stories within his podcast was his experience of being in a Jet Ranger up in Alaska and experiencing an engine failure, surrounded by grizzly bears, essentially. And so we talk about that. So I thought that would be a bit of a fun clip to reminisce about. So I hope you enjoy.
So in Alaska, at one point, I was in a Jet Ranger, and the engine failed, and I was the one who saw it because I happened to be staring at the gauges. So my pilot was looking outside, with his hands on he's looking outside and doing his thing, and I'm just staring at the gauges, and I see that little, that gauge that gives you the RPM, but it has one big needle and it has one little needle.
Sure, yeah, on the tack.
So I watched that little needle start to wobble, and I could hear it in the sound of the machine. So when that little needle would like wave a little bit, I could hear the engine sound change.
Sure.
And I'm just staring at that thing, and all of a sudden that little needle just started to unwind. And so of course I'm freaking out, and I said, "Oh!" And the headset, and my pilot, he snaps his head inside and he starts looking at the gauges, and by that time everything was coming down. And next thing I know, I mean, we were so low and close to the ground that there was no time to go from flying to to auto rotating, we're just like a 100-mile-an-hour brick. We're coming at the earth.
Yeah.
And I that's how I learned about auto rotation, was doing that.
Well, and it sounds like the pilot stuck it, because, being at, luckily, having that airspeed in that situation was actually probably your saving grace, because if you have enough airspeed, you can be lower in altitude and then use that energy to, perform, in this case, what sounded like, at least listening to the book, a successful auto rotation. You land, you guys figure out that there's, of course, no actual firearm on board to protect you from any of these grizzly bears. How close were you to the actual bears when that all happened?
I don't think we were necessarily that close where we touched down, but the thing about Alaska is the bears are everywhere. They're like giant rats.
Yeah.
And they're really hungry. And in this case, they were extremely hungry. They hadn't eaten since last year. And so any form of food, or how shall I put this? Anything that comes around them can be considered food. And they will rip a helicopter open.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
To get you and whatever else you have in the aircraft when they're that hungry.
That's so funny. It's weird because, like, last week I was telling my friend that I had a really weird dream. My buddy Brian, a good helicopter friend of mine, and in my dream I was visiting him on his house, which was kind of on the beach, but then in the woods. Long story short, all of a sudden all these bears started coming through the woods, and all we had to hide in was a 206. And I remember in my dream thinking, like, man, this bear is going to tear this thing apart. So I haven't experienced it in real life, but I, for whatever reason, dreamt it up recently. So I can imagine being in that actual experience was mildly terrifying.
Well, those bears in Alaska, they'll tear open a helicopter the way you and I would open a soda can. And two things that surprised me, because I knew what an auto rotation was, but what I didn't, I guess, expect was how far we bounced along the ground. We were still going fast when we hit the ground, and my pilot kept us upright, thank God.
Yeah.
So we didn't ball it up, but we went a long ways. And then in talking to helicopter pilots since then, they would tell me, well, that's kind of normal. A lot of helicopters, when you auto rotate, a lot of times you'll just slide along the ground. I never knew that part.
Totally.
The other thing that really stuck in my mind was just that sound of, after we skidded along the earth and the aircraft stopped moving, the absolute silence except for the engine out horn.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a burglar alarm. So now all is quiet, and we're sitting in our seats, and the only sound is just that engine out horn is just still screaming at us.
Yeah.
And
reach over, click the mute on that.
Yeah, it was interesting. And there's just so much about that. A lot of times I'll fly in Jet Rangers, and there's a placard on the instrument panel that says engine out, disabled. So I have flown in helicopters that were wrecked because the horn came on when the engine wasn't out, and the pilot felt forced to auto rotate and land, even though the engine was still running. And so it's weird how all of that comes together, and how when the engine stops, how little time. I'm sure for most pilots, when this happens to them, they're looking outside, they're busy, they're working, they're distracted. And when that horn comes on, it takes several seconds from the time they come back inside and are looking at the gauges and moving the controls to also try to figure out what is even going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, being a helicopter pilot, I'm often asked, what happens when the engine goes out? So I think I've explained auto rotations, and I was fortunate enough. I was kind of head of training for a large helicopter flight school in Oregon for a long time. And so I was fortunate to be a guy that was able to teach full down auto rotations in an R-22 out of all things for many years. And so I have a lot of experience. Now it fades fast. I don't think I would want to be in an engine out situation really ever, but specifically right now. Uh, but yeah, I mean, you depending on the conditions. I mean, if you have a nice headwind, you can sometimes grease it to where there's really no ground run. But in most situations, you're going to have that skidding, kind of across the ground.
Oh, okay.
In a real life situation, like you were in, specifically being low altitude, you're almost guaranteed that, the pilot probably did the best he could. And that's actually kind of the scary part of landing off airport auto rotation. The fact that he was able to keep the helicopter upright was extremely incredible and fortunate for you guys.
Yeah, he and I talked about it afterwards, and he kind of explained how he kept it upside right, and it was like, oh wow, I'm glad he did those things.
Yeah.
But so wait a second. So in an R-22, let's say the engine fails or partially fails. How much time do you have to come back inside and figure out what's going on and react with the controls?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So one of the things, and probably from our helicopter listeners, they would mostly agree with me that in the case of an emergency like that, so much of it has to do with actually just feeling the helicopter and understanding what the helicopter is going to feel like, and it's less about necessarily confirming what's going on in the cockpit. In an R-22 or in a real engine out situation for any helicopter, you're going to have a lot of secondary indications. You're going to hear the noise decrease. You're going to feel your tail is going to do, something interesting on a yaw, and you're going to kind of know right away. Now, there's actually a lot of situations, specifically in Bell. When I went to Bell School, the instructor pilot talked about false indications of engine problems. And when you're learning how to fly helicopters, every auto rotation you do is 3, 2, 1, lower collective, roll off throttle. And so there has been a lot of situations where maybe a pilot saw something on a gauge and just reacted. And the reaction was to lower collective and roll off throttle. And then they land and, you know, the engine's still running. Right. So it's kind of like a funny situation, but in a legitimate engine failure, the helicopter is going to give you multiple indications that hopefully if your training was adequate and you've prepared for it, everything would remain outside. I don't know if I would necessarily look inside until kind of the end when I'm doing my flare, just to kind of see where my RPMs are at. Not that I really care if I overspeed it, to even give myself a little more inertia. But that's the thing that I love about helicopters is, for me, it's like putting on a pair of pants, and it's an extension of my body. And so when you start to feel indications of, like when you were talking about the needle skipping, I bet you the pilot first started noticing little torque kicks, right? Changing that yaw, and he was probably already kind of analyzing these feelings. And that's probably what helped him prepare and be able to execute what sounds like to be a really good auto rotation. So that's my auto rotation talk for today. And I haven't instructed I haven't instructed for a long time, so I'm sure I'll get some well, that wasn't explained perfectly, but I think it was pretty good. All right, I hope you enjoyed that story from David. Again, if you want to listen to the full episode with David, it's episode number 23. David actually have got a lot of feedback on that episode. Because David actually shares, in my opinion, some really important life lessons, essentially of how he was able to get his foot in the door to this amazing career that he's had now for over 30 years. So please check out the entire episode, and also make sure that you follow David on social media. Again, it is Airborne Camera. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time saying that. Airborne Camera. Simple, easy. Go find it. He has a ton of followers. Let's see. Actually, I can click right now. 286,000 followers. So David's absolutely killing it. And he's such an awesome dude. So I was very lucky to have him on the podcast. The next guest that I want to showcase from 2023 is right here in Oregon. His name is Ben Clayton. And you might be familiar with him from episode number 15 of the Helicopter Podcast. And Ben is the CEO of Life Flight Network. excuse me, Life Flight Network is a non-for-profit air medical service up here in the Pacific Northwest, and a service that I'm super familiar with. In fact, when I sat down and I chatted with Ben, I was kind of reminiscing on this idea that I think Life Flight is a big reason how I got into helicopters. I grew up right down the road from their headquarters, and I would be seeing their helicopters fly over all the time. And I think it ignited that spark, gave me this idea of like, whoa, looking up, man, what is that? That looks pretty cool. And so big thanks to Life Flight, because I think that you've maybe inspired me in my helicopter journey. And big thank you for chatting with me. This was actually an in-person interview that I did with Ben. Again, it's episode number 15. And in the excerpt that we're going to play here on today's show, we talk about his journey from a Marine helicopter pilot to civilian line pilot for an air medical company to now the CEO of that air medical company. I think it's really cool. I'm an entrepreneur. I love business. And I love when helicopter businesses specifically take us, right? Us pilots, us men and women. They take us and they allow us to run the ship, be at the wheel of large companies. Who better than to run a helicopter company than helicopter specific people? And so I thought that was a really cool conversation. Again, it's episode number 15 with Ben Clayton. So we're going to play this clip. I hope you enjoy. So kind of transitioning over to you.
Yeah.
You started in the military. You're from Oregon.
Yeah.
You literally grew up in Canby. I'm pointing like people can see where I'm
Right,
pointing.
yeah.
But if you're listening and you're not familiar with the area, this is pretty neat. The fact that you're essentially in your backyard and you're the CEO of the fourth largest air medical provider in your backyard.
Yeah.
Like, was that, it's like a Nicholas Sparks book. Like, this is perfect. Like, how did that all work out? And, I know that you started in the military. Where do we go from there?
So I flew CH-53 Echoes in the Marine Corps. I was stationed in Miramar. I mean, it's tough duty, but somebody's got to do it.
Of course.
But no. So that's really where I got my start. My last tour was as a flight instructor, and probably the favorite job that I've ever had until now. It was as a flight instructor back at Whiting Field in Florida. Training all the new helicopter pilots for the Marines, Navy, and Coast Guard, and a few international students. And we're flying Bell 206s.
Nice.
No autopilot, but they're IFR certified because it's the military. So,
oh gosh.
You're flying approaches to MINS, ILS to MINS in a
206.
Bell 206.
Wow.
So pretty good experience, great experience. You get to do a lot of flying there. So I would some days fly 6 or 8 hours. So that was a great experience. And then it really gets you, back into the civilian rules when you're doing that, because you're teaching all of the civilian kind of rules, all the airway navigation, all those kinds of things that as a military pilot sometimes you forget because military has their own set of rules. And I think that really helped with the transition to the civilian side. Was doing that.
I have several buddies that have come from military to civilian, and I know that there's sometimes a bit of a transition. In the military, you're typically flying with 2 pilots.
Yeah.
You're in really, really nice equipment. I even remember having students, come from a Black Hawk to an R-22.
Yep.
Doing training. And, well, in the Black Hawk, we could land this way. I'm like, well, we're in an R-22. We can't quite do it this way. With that flight instruction, was it all military instructors, or was it a mix of military and civilian? Because I do know there are some civilian instructors teaching that ab initio training.
Yeah, so we had civilian instructors on the simulator side when we were there, and most of those, I think all of them were retired military.
Okay.
And then, for the most part, all the instructors that are actually flight instructors are military people that have done their at least one fleet tour, and now they're coming back to kind of shed their experience and knowledge. And then you have a reserve cadre that are there, and some of those guys had been there for 15, 20 years as reservists.
Okay.
Doing that flight training.
And what year did you finish that up?
So I left there in 2013.
Okay.
And I went to work for a company called CHC, who's a international oil and gas mostly. They do some search and rescue in the UK. But I got to fly 139s, AW139s for them in Mozambique for a couple of years.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah, it was not a bad job.
Not bad at all. And you said that was for oil and gas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to connect dots. I don't think I had anyone that was there.
Yeah, I mean, there's I've got a lot of good friends from there. That was a really good experience. Going through the type rating for the 139. I was pretty young at the time. I was early 30s. I was the youngest person in my type rating class by like a decade.
Yeah.
But you learn a lot of things there. I mean, because there's like, for example, there's something called floats on helicopters that go over the water. In the military, I'd never even heard of floats. So I'm, in class raising my hand. They kept talking about floats and how to pop the floats, and I'm raised my hand like an idiot. What are floats?
What are floats?
They're like, you deployed on a ship for 7 months and you don't know what floats are? So
that's wild.
Yeah.
I guess I always just assumed that the military helicopters probably had some type of floats. So, I mean, obviously not knowing about the floats, was there anything else that was kind of challenging coming from a military background to going to the civilian or to this first civilian job?
I think it was for me a pretty seamless transition. I think mostly because I was able to do that fleet or the flight instructor tour, where you're getting into the FAR aim, you're studying a ton in order to be able to ask the students questions and to teach the students. So doing that and getting really, really in-depth knowledge of the nuances of the civilian world and the rules and the regulations in the FAR aim was really helpful. So and then military, it's all hand flying. At least it was when I was in, and so that makes it easier. So you're learning to use an autopilot kind of for the first time, but all the hand flying stuff, came pretty easy.
Came naturally.
Yeah.
The 139 must be awesome too.
Oh, it was a phenomenal aircraft to fly.
I like what I'm doing in my career now on the sales side, but I did kind of stall my flying career a little bit. I've never flown anything with two engines.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So. I'm a little envious, with guys that have got experience in, say, a 139 or even a 429. I'd love to get my hands on a 429. But I guess you pick your path, right? So,
sure. Yeah.
So you do that for a couple years. Was there a little burnout that caused it just to be 2 years, or just wanted to kind of change gears?
Yeah, the travel gets pretty tough. I had a young family at the time. My daughter, I think when I started there, was about 4. And so she's getting ready to start school, and so the travel gets tough. And to get to Mozambique, it's a 5-hour flight to Atlanta, and then it's a 14-hour flight to South Africa, and then you've got a layover that's 12 or 14 hours, and then you've got another 3-hour flight up to, I was in Pemba, and then you're gone for 6 weeks at a time, and so it's just the travel got kind of long, and so an opportunity came up here. And that worked out well, actually, because right after I left, the oil market kind of had a big downturn, and so I had already had the job here, so it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that would be wild. I had some friends that flew in Angola,
yeah.
And some of the guys did it for years,
mm-hmm.
and month on, month off, travel.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I guess, I don't know how it worked for you, but I was just talking to my buddy Sean about it. He would, some days, duty on the day that he would actually get there. So here he is finishing this long travel period, and then he's dutying on. It's like, I just got back from Thailand, and that kicked my butt for like 7 days on jet lag. So,
yeah, fortunately, at least the contract that I was on, with CHC, and CHC was they do a safety summit every year. They're very safety oriented, and so I never had to do that where it's like you show up and then they want you to fly that day.
Yeah, but I thought that was wild. I definitely couldn't do it. So you had an opportunity, obviously. Being from Canby, you were familiar with Life Flight.
Yeah, I was, and I had kind of driven by the airport, and it's like, maybe I'll drop off a resume, and so I happened to drop it off at the front desk, and then a couple weeks later got a phone call. They just said, and I was getting ready to go do another trip to Africa, and so I said, well, I can interview, but it'd have to be like this week because I'm leaving on Saturday or whatever it was, and so. Yeah, they had me come in and made an offer that day, and that was that.
That's awesome. I like that you kind of were. This is kind of a funny story. my first turbine job was with Maverick helicopters,
Okay,
flying
sure.
tours, and I had lost my job in Texas, and I was kind of desperate.
Mm-hmm.
I was like parking cars as a valet. I was like, I need to be flying, and I could never hear back from anyone. It was kind of like that during that time that it almost seemed like a bit of a desert of hiring, especially for low time guys, and so I heard that Maverick was bringing people on with little to no turbine time, which was a kind of a new thing for them. So I sent a resume off, and like that day I heard from the chief pilot, which never happened. It never happens ever, and it finally happened. And it was just before Christmas, and I was so stressed I wasn't making any money. And the chief pilot there at the time said, yeah, come, we'll get you in for an interview after Christmas. And I was like, oh man, I can't wait till that's in 3 or 4 weeks. So I was like, I'm actually going to be in Vegas this week, like if you're available. And, sure enough, like 2 days later, he's like, cool, can you meet me tomorrow? And I was in San Antonio at the time, like I better get airfare. But, I think it's important sometimes, like to, if you need to get a job, just do what it takes to get there. And I've never publicly told that story, so now I've
Now the
told it
world
to
knows.
everyone. Now the world knows. Jim O, if you're listening, I'm sorry for telling you that I was in Vegas, but I showed up on time, so I was there. So you get hired at Life Flight as a line pilot,
Yeah.
and this is still boggles me. I'm very excited to hear kind of your process and your experience here, but that's in 2015, 2023 now, and here I'm sitting with you in the corner office as the CEO of this large air medical company. Was that something that you ever even thought of, or you just came on to be a line pilot?
Yeah, no, my philosophy kind of in general is do the best you can do wherever you are. When I was in Africa working, we had a really great crew there, and we all just worked hard. And even when we weren't flying, we'd get together and study, right? Be professional, learn everything you can learn. And so I've always kind of had that mentality. I never had if I do this, then I could get the next step, right? Things have just worked out, I guess. That how I got into the management role here. I was a line pilot, and then we were growing, and they needed a training guy. They never had a training person before. It was always the assistant chief pilots or the chief pilot DO that would do all the training. And were about to do a big merger, and grow, and a lot of pilots needed to be trained. So they were going to hire a training guy. Well, I had a training background from my time in the Marines, and so I applied for that job and got it. So then I was like a float pilot and a training pilot. And so I did that. So I was a float pilot for a year, and then I was the training pilot / float pilot for about a year. And we were getting ready to open a base in Bozeman, Montana, and I was standing a night shift in Astoria, Oregon. And I got off the night shift, and I'm driving home, which is about a 2-hour drive home for me. And the current director of safety at that time called me up, and he said he knew that I'd been to aviation safety officer school when I was in the Marines, and so he knew that I had that safety kind of background. And so he called up and he said, hey, have you ever thought about being the safety guy, because I want to go be a line pilot in Bozeman, Montana. So he was going to step back from management and then go do the 7-day on, 7-day off schedule and get to fly a lot in Bozeman. And I kind of said, yeah, I guess. I hadn't really thought about it, but he said, okay, well, the CEO would like to meet with you in like 2 hours. Can you get here? And so, I drove in here, interviewed, and a couple months, like a month later, I guess, I was the director of safety. And so then again, just grow where you plant it, study hard, work hard. And then I've had various kind of opportunities since then, just kind of doing good things at the company. I think I spent some time as the DO on an interim basis while we were recruiting for our current DO. I eventually got promoted to be the chief safety officer, and so I was in charge of several different departments in addition to safety at the company. And then eventually became the COO, and I was the COO for about a year, and then moved into this role.
All right. So again, super fun conversation I had with Ben. If you want to check out the full episode, it's episode number 15. You can check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Vertical Helicast, of course, has all of my helicopter podcast listings. So check out Ben's and all the other podcasts, of course. And the final episode that I want to just kind of reminisce about as we close up the year here was with my good buddy Jackie Sanders. Jackie and I met each other. I think we talked about it in the episode. I think it's going on like 6+ years ago when we both were in orientation and training for Air Evac Life Team, an air medical company. Now it's owned by GMR, and Jackie's actually still an active pilot for them. I hung up the flight helmet, so to speak, with Air Evac a couple years ago to pursue my business, Helicopter, but had a great experience there. And one of my highlights is that Jackie just happened to be in my class. Jackie is an awesome dude. He's from the Midwest, and he's really a jack of all trades in aviation. Yeah, started off his aviation career in the military, flying Blackhawks, going into Lakota. He's an AMP. He's really well versed in the civilian helicopter flying world. He's been flying air medical for a long time. Even before flying an Air Evac, he was flying for another air medical operator. And he has a lot of ag flying experience. And this is actually what I want to talk about, or what I want to reshare, is his experience of a couple years ago with him involved in a wire strike accident while flying ag. I think it's amazing when people, not just Jackie, but anyone within this industry that walks away from an accident, who's open and willing to share that experience. And because I think that there's something that we can all learn to hopefully make the industry a little bit safer, to make us safer. And so being able to actually talk with Jackie, thank goodness that he's alive and okay after a pretty serious accident, is incredible. We get to kind of hear firsthand the whole breakdown and some of the things that led to him contacting a wire. So in this clip, Jackie talks about that experience. I do want to preference this again. I said this in the episode, but just in case it's not actually on this clip set, that literally Jackie is one of the best and most professional aviators I know. And so the fact that he had this incident, this accident, is a testament that we are all vulnerable. So I hope that you listen to this and can take something away from it and become a little bit safer. Enjoy this episode. And for number wise, Jackie's episode was number 35. So here's a little excerpt. So I know that when you were flying air medical, you were also taking some time off during the ag season to fly ag. Obviously, very lucrative thing to do, kind of change of pace. And I know a couple of years ago, very busy corn season, lots of flying, a lot of accidents. I think, I don't know if you know the total number, but I think at the time of your accident, you were maybe the 6th or 7th accident that I had heard about. And I really appreciate you coming on. And one of the things that I want to talk about is your accident.
Yeah.
And so, I appreciate your openness to that. And, I think our listeners will appreciate that as well. When was that, 2 years ago now or 3?
I think 3. I'd have to look. I think it was 3.
Wow. Time flies. I
It
remember
does.
exactly where I was getting a text message from you of a balled up R66 and you texting me saying, I had an accident and here's the pictures. And I was mortified, but also very stoked that you were the one texting me and I wasn't hearing about it from someone else because, let's be honest, it was a very severe accident. Kind of walk us through that season leading up to that day.
Yeah. So like you touched on in that time frame, there were 7 wire strikes in 7 days, and that was all by ag helicopters, and that was an accident. It was a wire strike, and it wasn't a sneaky wire. It wasn't one that come out of a wood line to somebody's house that you couldn't see. It was a cross country power line, and it was the static discharge line at the top. That I knew was there. And you hear with a lot of wire strike accidents that I knew it was there, So looking back on it, I have nothing to attribute my accident to other than fatigue. And like I said, going back to and this isn't like, I'm not trying to lobby against anybody or anything like that, or get an industry regulated. That's not my goal at all. I'm just sharing the facts. But
Sure.
like, Part 137, there's no flight time restrictions. And like I said, commission-based aviation, commission-based pilot pay is the most conducive to accidents, So I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it was my 13th day in a row flying, and it was the perpetual, well, it's supposed to rain tomorrow, so we'll take tomorrow off. It's supposed to be too windy tomorrow, that kind of deal. And I don't shift blame to anybody but myself. It's just as easy for me to say no as it is anybody else. But I was about 8 hours into my 13th day, and in the previous 12 days, I'd flown like 170 some odd hours. It was 14, 15 hours a day of sitting
I
in the
mean,
seat.
that's what you fly at Air Evac in a year, right?
Yeah, so
If you're lucky.
you sit back and you back on that and you're like, oh, this is obvious what happened. That was real stupid. Why did you do that? But like I said, it's like when you're in the midst of, that's like from flying Air EMS, they have people from outside that can pull the plug on the operation. Like you may look at the weather and they think everything's fine, and the crew thinks everything's fine, and you get a call from dispatch saying, "Hey, man, we're going to set this one out. We just don't like the way it looks." It's like the polar opposite in ag. It's like you're making all the decisions and you're immersed in the situation there. But just to kind of set it up a little bit, like I said, it was a wire I knew about. It's fatigue related, and what I learned from that accident is that apparently fatigue is a real thing. I always thought it was like a social construct, like young people don't get tired. And, we think of tired as like, I'm sleepy, I want to go lay down or whatever. I tell people, like when I talk to people about the accident, it was, I didn't know this was a term at the time, but the term for what happened is microsleep. And microsleep it's happened to all of us before. You're driving down the interstate and you look, you kind of come about yourself and you're like, mile marker 20, and you're like, the last thing I remember is mile marker 5.
Yeah,
You don't remember
100%.
Yeah, so it's happened to all of us, and that was essentially what happened. So I was flying a field that had terrain like rolling hills, so you couldn't see over the next hill. Essentially, like you're just flying, you're like, okay, there's the hilltop, and you couldn't see what was on the other side of the hill until you got on top of the hill. And the wires were in kind of one of those valleys of between the hilltops, and I just thought I had one more hilltop, but I was just so fatigued and mentally drained, chronically fatigued, that it was an absolute surprise to me when I crested that hilltop and there were cross country power lines in my windshield. And it's one of those like what it was outside of the capabilities of the helicopter to even do anything about it, because you go under the power lines, which is a routine thing in ag, and it's like, well, now you have a hilltop behind, you're never going to make that, and it's like max gross weight, you can't make it over the things. So, I made an effort to get over them and caught a skid tube on the static discharge line that's on the top of, like not the three big conductor wires, but the one that's, at the top of the power lines.
Sure. So
And
it was
then I was
actually, so you saw the line, tried to go up, and you got over the three main lines, but then your skid tube caught that top line.
Yep. And it just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. I didn't even break the wire. I talked to my buddy later, months after the accident that works for a power company. He's like, yeah, man, that's 1/2 inch stainless steel line. Like we use hydraulic bolt cutters to cut that line. He's like, you weren't making it through that.
Your little Robinson skid is not going to cut it.
Yeah, no, not happening.
So at that point, how high up is the line, and do you remember the accident itself, or was there a time of unconsciousness?
I'm going to say it was probably a 75 to 80 foot fall from the ground, or from, to the ground. I don't remember a whole lot about, except, I don't know. I know you have you've flown an R66 a lot, but I don't know how much you've like went out and done more than just, flying from airport to airport, that kind of stuff. But if you or you have A-Star experience too, the hydraulic transparency in the A-Star that everybody likes to talk about flying A-Stars. Well,
Yep.
66 has a similar issue. If you make an abrupt movement on the cyclic, it will kind of lock up on you for a second. It'll feel like you reached over and turned the hydraulics off. So obviously, me making a quick movement trying to climb over the thing, that happened. So it's like the cyclic kind of froze up, and of course, my life depends on it at this point. So
Ugh.
I keep pulling on the thing, and the cyclic grip actually broke off. So
Wow.
that's a scary
That's
that's a
literally
scary
how
thing to
hard you were
have.
pulling.
Yeah, that's a scary thing to have happen to you. And then I just remember getting tangled up in the wires, and then looking at pictures, it kind of got stopped dead in its tracks and fell directly back, like vertical on the tail cone. That's kind of the last thing I remember until I was at the hospital. So
Man, yeah, that's wild. Do you, didn't you exit the aircraft too, but you don't necessarily like recall? Like you were not actually in the
yeah,
aircraft when they found you?
yeah, I have some vague memories of it was in a cornfield, so I knew there was no way I would be found like in a cornfield. So I have some vague memories of like trying to make it to the edge of the cornfield. I think I ended up walking down some sort of ravine or something and into like a drainage ditch, and I couldn't make it up either side, so I just kind of hung out there. And what I'm told is luckily there was another ag operator in the immediate vicinity, and his loader guy heard the accident and kind of radioed to him and was like, "Hey, I'm pretty sure a helicopter just crashed over here. Like, come over here and help me look." And so that guy's actually the one that found me. And then that's just a story I'm told. I don't even remember any of that. So
That's crazy. Were you did a helicopter come and pick you up or were you taken by
no,
ambulance?
no. Ironically, I was taken in by ambulance. I'm not sure. Now knowing what my injuries were, like it was, textbook. I don't know why they didn't send a helicopter out there, but I went to like a small ER, um, and then they kind of stabilized me there. And then I did my only flight on a Bell 429. I was laying down in the back of it. So because they flew me from that hospital to a bigger hospital. Um, so
So you were eventually airlifed,
yeah, yeah,
and you got your
from
first.
ER to
Did
ER.
you were you coherent during your 429 ride?
No, no, I think I was a lot of drugs on board, a lot of medications. So I was stabilized at that point, but I just don't remember it. Just the only thing I remember from that flight is, because you having their medical experience, it's like, and they start hanging blood and like giving a patient blood, like it's gone to the next level. So the only thing I remember is being concerned and like asking the nurse, like, why are y'all giving me blood? Like, why have you, because that was like in my mind, I was like, oh, this must be a whole thing now. Like it must be
Yeah,
something serious.
yeah. Like, oh, I really actually hurt myself. Is
Yeah.
that was that? That's kind of a wild experience. That you has it kind of changed the way that you look at air medical as a pilot and that patient sitting in the back? For me personally, when I was flying air medical, I tried my best to kind of disconnect myself from that person riding along because I didn't want that emergency to make me do anything to kind of push it and whatnot. I can't. What's the saying? It's like not your emergency type of deal. But
Yeah.
you have firsthand experience of the power uh, of life saving. That goes into being able to get air transported. Has it changed you at all? And kind of your appreciation, or is it just kind of it is what it is?
I think maybe like on the appreciation factor, but no, it hasn't changed a whole lot about how, like you said, how I approach doing the job. Because, like, and you know how it is, they want you to kind of disassociate from that, and not to get too far into it, but that's kind of a really big thing between when a military pilot comes into civilian flying, especially EMS. It's two completely different mentalities. Like I did the equivalent of air EMS in the Army, overseas in Iraq, and it was like the mindset there is like we're all going to put our life on the line to go get that guy, whereas it's the complete opposite on the civilian side. It's like
100%.
our three lives are not to be put at risk to save this person that's already having, a bad day. So anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but yeah, that's, it didn't, not a whole lot. I still kind of approach the job with the same mentality, but, yeah, that experience does kind of the gravity of what you're doing is greater, but not how I really approach doing the job.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you talking about it. I know that talking about those types of experiences, specifically on a public forum, is intense to
Yeah.
say the least. So I appreciate you talking about it. And I think that as aviation, we're all in this together. We're all in the helicopter industry together. And I do agree that we do see a lot of consistent accidents within 137 work, specifically driven by what you said, commission based, pays, uh, no time restraints, no consecutive day limits, things like that. I would like to probably see, some things kind of start to change because, 7 wire strikes in 7 days to me is like an unacceptable figure. To me, like that's a systemic issue. And for our listeners out there, I'm not just saying this to butter Jackie up. Jackie is one of the most responsible professional pilots that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with. And so for him to have this accident, to me, that means anyone could have this accident because, Jackie, you truly are very much a professional aviator. And so, I think it's really an illuminating thing, and to hear that you had that accident made me think like, man, if it's happening to him, it could literally happen to anyone. At the end of the day, what were the actual injuries that were sustained?
I had 7 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a punctured spleen.
Ooh,
So yeah, I think it was fortunately it was all blunt force trauma, and I don't really know where. Never really was able to piece back like what I hit, any of that kind of stuff. I will tell you, it's wearing a helmet. That's a lot of most ag guys will wear a helmet, and the doctor like looking at because I believe they took my helmet with me, because that's kind of a common thing in the medical field. Like they want to see like how bad somebody's helmet was, or protective gear was
sure.
damaged. And the doctor was like, "Hey, no doubt in my mind, if you weren't wearing a helmet, like you would have been donezo." So I don't know what my helmet hit, but um, so yeah, so that was a big factor is I was wearing a helmet.
All right. Well, special thanks again to Jackie for being on the Helicopter Podcast and sharing so much. Like that was the end of the podcast. We talked about his accident. Before that, we talked about his military career. We talk about flying air medical, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly. So check out episode number 35 along with all the other podcasts. Get caught up. Make that your New Year's resolution. Of course, you must get caught up with the Helicopter Podcast. So starting Tuesday, January 2nd, you can start off fresh and ready to go for the 2024 The Helicopter Podcast season. So many exciting things to come. Heli Expo kind of being first big item on the list. If you're not going to be in Anaheim this year, I'm sorry to hear that because I'm going to be there along with John Gray from the Hangar Z podcast. I'm not sure if Jason's coming yet. Jason Quinn from The Real Rescue. I hope he is. But regardless, it will be great to meet with our listeners, our friends. So if you are going to Anaheim, please let me know. I would love the opportunity to meet you. We're also going to be doing podcasts live from HAI. So that's also very exciting. And we're going to be kind of shooting, or at least the Helicopter Podcast is going to be shooting firsthand as it comes, moments from Heli Expo. So please make sure that you find us on social media. The Helicopter Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. Pretty easy to find. Make sure that you also look us up on YouTube. 2023 got a new studio. Pretty proud of it. Small world. If you recall, my contractor just so happened, randomly didn't know him before. Adam Rickard ended up being a helicopter pilot. He's a flight instructor now at Leading Edge here in Bend, Oregon. And he's also a contractor that I hired randomly, not knowing he was a helicopter pilot. And he helped with my I think it's amazing, biased opinion of my studio space. So make sure that you're checking us out on YouTube, the Helicopter Podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe on all your listening platforms for podcasts. And again, big thanks to Vertical Helicasts and the whole MHM family for making this podcast possible. And of course, our sponsors, Bell Helicopter and Celicopter. I'm just feeling so lucky and so excited for the Helicopter Podcast. And I know that 2024 is going to be even better than 2023. So please stay tuned, keep listening, keep reaching out. Happy holidays and have a safe new year.
This podcast is brought to you by Celicopter. Tired of listings that go nowhere? Exhausted by tire kickers who waste your time? Don't sell your helicopter alone. Celicopter handles the entire process from start to finish. So, if your helicopter has sat too long waiting for a buyer, contact the team at Celicopter today for your complimentary market valuation. Call 1-855-Celicopter, 1-855-735-5226, or email sales@celicopter.com. Celicopter. List it, sell it, done.